This is Democracy Watch. So, Mark, we've got some huge court decisions that we're waiting on here. So, I wanted to make this episode with you and kind of let everybody know what's on the docket here. So, first off, we've got two cases at the U.S. Supreme Court with everybody's attention, and that's regarding Donald Trump, the disqualification case, and also the presidential immunity case. So, when do you anticipate we'll see rulings on those cases?
Yeah, so let's take them in reverse order. The immunity case, Donald Trump's position is borderline frivolous. I mean, it's just a preposterous position that they have laid out, that somehow presidents can do whatever they want. They could, I mean, under his theory, Joe Biden could kidnap Donald Trump right now, and there's nothing anyone could do about it, right? So the immunity case is going to go through the Court of Appeals, the DC Circuit. I think that's going to be done very, very quickly. The argument is on January 9th. I expect we'll get a decision from the Court of Appeals in DC very quickly, in part because the DC Circuit has already ruled in a related or sort of related civil case involving where Donald Trump is a defendant in that was brought by a police officer who was injured on January 6th. And so the DC Circuit already there said he was not immune. And I think the DC Circuit will again say he's not immune in this criminal case. Then it will go quickly to the Supreme Court. I expect, given the stakes here, which is that it's a criminal case that is currently on hold, we will get a Supreme Court decision by the end of January. Now, that will still mean the moving of the trial in DC, but only by a few weeks. It won't fundamentally alter the trajectory. Donald Trump is going to stand trial for his crimes. Donald Trump is not above the law, and Donald Trump is going to face a jury of his peers, at least in Washington, D.C., if not in Washington, D.C. and New York before the election. So I think that's what we have on that case. Now, the second case, the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, this is the question of whether he can be on the ballot or not. This case has been petitioned by the Trump campaign, or by Donald Trump, and by the Republican Party of Colorado, because he lost this case. So everyone needs to understand, Donald Trump goes before the Supreme Court in that case as a loser, right? He's got to overturn what the state Supreme Court of Colorado has said. And as someone who read his brief, and you and I talked about this recently, it is a weak opening gambit that he led with. And I expect that the Supreme Court, given the quick turn that it has had around these things, we will probably have a decision also in that case before the end of January. So everyone needs to be watching our Democracy Watch videos that you and I do, because I know we will have something when those decisions come out, and hopefully people also follow Democracy Docket for it, because these are going to be blockbusters this month.
Right. And for those who aren't yet following Democracy Docket, it's the free news outlet Mark founded to focus on everything voting and elections. I'll put the link on this screen and also in the post description of this video. So if you're not yet signed up, it is a great resource. It's one I use every single day. So please make sure to sign up. Mark, if the Supreme Court does rule in Trump's favor in either of those cases, the immunity case or the disqualification case, what are the implications for our democracy more broadly moving forward?
I mean, if they rule in his favor on the immunity case, then honestly, we have just created a dictatorship. Because if presidents enjoy immunity from the law, like I said, I mean, Joe Biden could simply cancel the elections. He could simply say, I'm not leaving office, right? Because there's nothing you can do. There's no remedy for anything that any president does, no matter how outrageous. Now, no one thinks that that's going to be the outcome. I think that Donald Trump doesn't even think he's going to win the immunity case. I think Donald Trump thinks he's going to delay his criminal trial and avoid facing trial in Washington, D.C. before the election, because he then thinks he can pardon himself or whatever if he gets elected. So I think Donald Trump is on the immunity case, is a cornered animal who is a scared animal. He is scared of going to trial in Washington, D.C., as he should, because if he faces a jury of his peers in Washington, D.C. on the evidence that Jack Smith has, he's going to get convicted and he's going to face prison time. Now, the other case, which is the one you asked about, which is the one that in some ways getting more serious attention, is whether he can be disqualified from the ballot. Now, he's very nervous about that. I watch his body language. I watch his lawyer's body language about that case. They're worried because, again, this is game, set, match. If Donald Trump loses on that case, he is off the ballot throughout the country. Donald Trump will not be a candidate for president in 2024 or any time. And so if he wins that case, if he loses that case, I think what it means for American democracy is that the Supreme Court will have blinked at the Constitution. It will have stared at Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War to prevent precisely people like Donald Trump from running, and they will have blinked. They will have not had the courage of their convictions. So that will be a bad thing for democracy, but not nearly as important as the first case.
Okay. There's also a big case coming up in front of the Supreme Court in South Carolina. So what can we expect in that state?
So the South Carolina case is a racial gerrymandering case. Essentially, in a nutshell, the Republicans in South Carolina wanted to make Nancy Mace, who is a conservative MAGA Republican who was portraying herself as a moderate, they wanted to let her be full MAGA. And to do that, they had to move a whole bunch of black voters out of her district to make it more reliably Republican and conservative. So they did that. A court in South Carolina, of all places, by the way, a federal court, struck that down, said this was a racial gerrymander. The case is now before the Supreme Court. We are awaiting a decision to see whether the Supreme Court says that this was an impermissible racial gerrymander, like the trial court did. And if so, they will be a new map in time for 2024. You can count on that. And if not, we will see what the Supreme Court says. I expect, because of the timing, I think that will also be a decision. I sound like a broken record. That's going to be a January decision.
Now, is there any other indication based on what the Supreme Court has ruled previously in analogous cases that might suggest how they would rule in South Carolina?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question, Brian, because the Supreme Court, the conservatives on the Supreme Court have sometimes showed hostility to the Voting Rights Act. But racial gerrymandering is basically saying states shouldn't have used race as the predominant factor. And as you might imagine, that actually has some appeal to some conservative justices, right? Because they are usually skeptical about the use of race in a whole host of areas. So in previous racial gerrymandering cases, it's been a long time since the U.S. Supreme Court has not ruled in favor of striking down a racial gerrymander. So odds are, just ideologically and precedentially going in, that the NAACP and the ACLU that brought this case are in really strong position. Now, the question is whether or not the conservatives on the Supreme Court will remain ideologically consistent, or whether they will want, to sort of, find a way here to save Nancy Mace's congressional seat.
Now, we've also got cases pending on mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, two crucial states as we head into 2024. What are the implications of those cases?
So I think there are two implications. The first is what it means for voters. And the second, Brian, is something you and I talk a lot about, which is the incredible hypocrisy of the Republican Party. I mean, my God. I mean, if you looked up the word chutzpah in the dictionary, and I think chutzpah is now in like regular dictionaries, right? Yeah. It's not just like the Yiddish dictionaries. There is a picture of Ronna McDaniel standing next to the RNC, because at the same time that the RNC and Republicans are saying that they want to have Republicans vote by mail, right? Bank their vote or whatever it's called. They have their lawyers in court trying to disqualify ballots. In the case of Wisconsin, it's that when you fill out your absentee ballot in Wisconsin, you need a witness. If your witness doesn't include their zip code, right? They sign their name, they've put in their address, they don't put their zip code, or they put their zip code, but they don't put the state Wisconsin. Well, what state would it be, right? Plus, if they have the zip code, that somehow your ballot should be thrown out. In Pennsylvania, the case involves where the voter signs their absentee ballot envelope and forgets to put a date next to their signature. Well, who cares what date they put next to their signature? Right. The counties, when they receive the ballot, they date stamp them. Yeah. They date stamp them, even if they're not postmarked. They date stamp the receipt. The county knows what date it came in. Who cares what date? What's interesting is in Pennsylvania, the counties don't even care what date. You could put a date 100 years in the past or 100 years in the future, and that the Republicans say are okay. It's just these ballots that are undated. And so these are just excuses in these two cases, one or series of cases in Wisconsin, this big important case in Pennsylvania, where Republicans are trying to find any excuse, any technicality to toss lawful ballots. So these are vitally important cases. The one in Pennsylvania is before the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, very important case there. In Wisconsin, recent victory in one of these cases that presumably Republican state legislators will now appeal. But there's a whole series of cases in Wisconsin to watch right now, and they're all on Democracy Docket, about how ballots get, counted, and how they get discarded. We talk a lot in this country about the right to vote, and for too many voters, they cast a ballot only to find out later the ballot didn't count. And in that fight, you have a clear break between what progressive and voting rights organizations think is right on one side and what MAGA Republicans think on the other.
And finally, to that exact point, we've seen instances of Republican election vigilantism. You've called this the biggest issue as we head into 2024, the biggest issue that we have to stay on top of. And these right-wing groups have been largely successful in intimidating voters and election workers and state officials. So what are the lawsuits against them seeking to do?
Yeah, I mean, can you just imagine that it is 2024 and we are facing in our country a crisis of election officials who are afraid to go to work. They're being doxxed, they're being swatted, people resigning from office, that candidates and voters find themselves facing intimidation. Voters, in Maricopa County, remember last election, trying to drop their ballots off in a ballot drop box only to find people videotaping them while wearing body armor and carrying guns. This issue of election intimidation and election vigilantism by these conservative organizations is going to be a crisis of 2024. And if we don't take it seriously and get our arms around it, it can undo our democracy. So there are a series of lawsuits that are going on right now that are trying to deal with this, both by taking away the pretextual laws that are used to challenge these voters, and other lawsuits aimed at the intimidators themselves. But Brian, this is something that is, that I think, again, much of the mainstream media has not focused on how much Donald Trump has inspired a kind of right-wing, a notion of right-wing vigilantism to target voters and election officials, and we need that to stop. We need that to be told that it's not okay. And we need the courts to step in these cases.
Yeah, and obviously you and I will continue sounding the alarms about this just like we have done and will continue to do as it becomes more and more of an issue in 2024. And of course, for anybody watching, you can follow along with all of this stuff, again, in Democracy Docket. If you're not yet signed up, the link is right here on the screen. It's also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.